The quickest way to underestimate someone is to mistake an accent for intelligence. On a cool autumn evening in Midtown Manhattan, the glass walls of the Sterling Grand Convention Center reflected thousands of city lights as executives, international investors, and government officials gathered for what financial reporters had already called one of the most important business meetings of the year. Inside the breathtaking ballroom, every polished marble floor shimmered beneath towering crystal chandeliers, while television crews quietly prepared for a live corporate broadcast that would be watched by millions across the country. At the center of the attention stood Daniel Whitmore, a 52-year-old white billionaire chief executive officer whose company was only minutes away from negotiating a $4.2 billion international infrastructure agreement. Every confident smile, every measured handshake, and every carefully rehearsed sentence reflected a man accustomed to controlling every room he entered. Nearby, weaving gracefully through the elegant crowd with a silver serving tray balanced effortlessly in her hands, was Ava Carter, a 29-year-old black waitress whose neatly pressed black waitress apron blended almost invisibly into the background of the luxurious event. To nearly everyone in attendance, she was simply another member of the hotel staff, making certain that glasses remained full and guests remained comfortable. Nobody noticed how carefully she listened whenever international delegates spoke among themselves, or how naturally her eyes followed every conversation unfolding around the ballroom. As Daniel greeted a delegation of overseas executives near the main reception area, one distinguished guest unexpectedly turned toward Ava and politely asked for directions to a private conference lounge. Ava smiled warmly before answering in careful English. Her pronunciation carried traces of several cultures shaped by years of moving between countries, causing her words to sound slower than the polished speech surrounding her. Before she could finish explaining the route, Daniel let out a short laugh that echoed louder than he intended. Several nearby executives looked toward him. "If you are going to speak with our international guests," he said with a confident grin, "you should probably learn proper English first." A few uncomfortable chuckles spread through the group. Someone lowered their eyes. Another executive forced an awkward smile, unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. The international guest looked briefly at Ava, then at Daniel, saying nothing. Ava's expression never changed. She simply lowered her head slightly and answered in a calm voice. "I am sorry if my English caused any confusion, sir. I hope your meeting goes well tonight." Without another word, she quietly continued serving guests throughout the ballroom as though nothing unusual had happened. Daniel barely thought about the exchange again. To him, it was an insignificant moment lost among countless conversations before a historic negotiation. But several cameras broadcasting the evening had already captured everything, including the brief silence that followed his remark and the quiet dignity with which Ava walked away. Far above the ballroom, a large digital countdown clock displayed 15 minutes until the $4.2 billion meeting would begin. Daniel straightened his tuxedo, accepted another congratulatory handshake, and confidently walked toward the executive conference suite, completely unaware that the woman whose English he had just mocked would soon become the only person capable of saving the most important deal of his entire career. 15 minutes is an eternity when everything is under control, but it disappears in an instant when success begins slipping away. Daniel Whitmore entered the secure executive conference suite with the same confidence that had defined every major negotiation of his career. Sterling Global's legal team arranged confidential documents, financial analysts reviewed final projections, and television producers prepared to broadcast the ceremonial signing that would conclude the $4.2 billion agreement. Everything appeared perfectly organized until the lead representative of the international consortium unexpectedly stood before anyone else spoke. In calm but unmistakably firm English, he smiled politely and said, "Before we begin, our board has made one final procedural change. We have decided that all negotiations will be conducted directly without interpreters. Every technical discussion, legal clarification, and financial adjustment must be communicated naturally among the participating delegates." A quiet murmur spread across the room. Daniel glanced toward his communications director with visible confusion. That had never been mentioned during months of preparation. The communications director quickly checked several messages before leaning closer. Our chief interpreter is still at John F. Kennedy International Airport, she whispered. A severe weather delay has grounded every incoming flight. The backup interpreter is attending another government conference in Washington. Daniel remained composed on the outside, but his thoughts accelerated. Connect someone remotely, he answered. The technology manager immediately shook his head. The consortium specifically prohibited remote interpretation because several confidential documents cannot legally be discussed through unsecured international connections. Across the table, another delegate politely added, some of our specialists will switch between English, Japanese, French, German, and Mandarin depending on technical subjects. We prefer direct communication because legal terminology often loses precision through multiple translations. Daniel slowly realized the challenge was much greater than expected. The legal team quietly admitted that even a single misunderstanding involving intellectual property, regulatory compliance, or infrastructure standards could delay the agreement for months. Outside the conference suite, the elegant gala continued as though nothing had changed. Waiters served champagne, journalists interviewed guests, and investors anticipated a celebration that now hung by a thread. Ava Carter calmly continued her evening responsibilities, greeting visitors with the same quiet professionalism she had displayed after Daniel's public remark. She carried fresh coffee into a nearby reception lounge where several foreign delegates casually discussed technical specifications in their native languages. Without interrupting, she naturally understood every exchange while silently noticing that one translated briefing folder contained an important wording error capable of creating significant confusion during the negotiation. She paused for only a moment before placing the folder neatly back on the table. Correcting executives was not part of her job. She quietly walked away, believing someone else would eventually discover the mistake. Back inside the executive conference suite, Daniel's legal counsel received an urgent message from one of the international advisors. His expression immediately changed. He looked directly at Daniel and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Sir, one of the hotel staff may actually be the only person in this building who can keep this meeting from falling apart. Sometimes the greatest talent in the room is the one nobody thought was worth listening to. Daniel Whitmore stared at his legal counsel, convinced he had misunderstood what he had just heard. One of the hotel staff? He asked quietly. The attorney nodded without hesitation. One of the international advisors recognized her during the reception. They believe her name is Ava Carter. Daniel frowned. The waitress? Before anyone could answer, the senior representative from the Japanese delegation spoke with polite confidence. Your waitress is not unfamiliar to us, Mr. Whitmore. Several years ago, she moderated multilingual trade negotiations for an international consulting firm in Singapore. I attended one of those sessions. The room immediately fell silent. Daniel looked around the conference table, expecting someone to dismiss the statement as a misunderstanding, but no one spoke. Instead, another delegate from Germany gently added, I remember her as well. She handled discussions involving English, German, and French with remarkable precision. Daniel felt the certainty he had carried all evening begin to crack. Only 20 minutes earlier, he had laughed at the way Ava spoke English. Now respected international executives were describing her as someone capable of leading negotiations across multiple languages. His communications director hurriedly searched through publicly available professional records before stopping abruptly. Sir, she whispered, they are right. She turned her laptop toward him. Although Ava's current employment listed only the luxury hotel, archived professional profiles revealed that she had previously worked as an international negotiation consultant specializing in multilingual commercial agreements across North America, Europe, and Asia. She had quietly stepped away from that career several years earlier after her mother became seriously ill. Since then, she had accepted flexible hospitality work to remain close to home while serving as her mother's primary caregiver. Daniel stared at the screen, struggling to connect the accomplished professional described in those records with the woman wearing a black waitress apron whom he had publicly embarrassed only minutes before. Outside the conference suite, Ava continued serving guests with the same calm professionalism, completely unaware that her past had suddenly become the center of attention inside one of the most important boardrooms in Manhattan. As she refreshed coffee cups in a private reception lounge, she overheard two delegates discussing a translated contract clause in rapid French before switching naturally into English. Without thinking, she quietly paused beside the table. "Excuse me," she said gently. "I believe the English version says operational control, but the original French wording actually refers to operational responsibility. Those terms are legally different." The two delegates looked at each other in surprise before comparing both documents. After a careful review, one of them smiled with genuine admiration. "You are absolutely correct." Ava simply apologized for interrupting, wished them a successful meeting, and continued down the corridor carrying her serving tray as though nothing unusual had happened. One of the delegates immediately contacted Daniel's legal counsel. "If that woman had not noticed the translation, we would have entered the meeting with conflicting legal interpretations." Inside the executive conference suite, Daniel slowly closed the laptop. Every assumption he had made about Ava collapsed beneath the weight of undeniable evidence. The woman whose English he had mocked had not struggled because she lacked intelligence. She had spoken carefully because English was only one of several languages she mastered, and now the $4.2 billion agreement depended on the very person he had chosen to underestimate. Real leadership begins the moment pride is forced to step aside. Daniel Whitmore left the executive conference suite without saying another word, his polished shoes carrying him through the elegant ballroom that only minutes earlier had felt completely under his command. The laughter that had followed his careless remarks still echoed in his memory, but now every step felt heavier than the last. Around him, guests continued smiling. Servers moved gracefully between tables, and photographers captured images of an evening that no one realized had quietly shifted in an unexpected direction. Daniel scanned the room until he spotted Ava Carter placing fresh coffee beside a group of elderly investors. She thanked each guest with the same calm professionalism she had shown throughout the evening, never displaying the slightest sign of resentment. She had every reason to be offended, yet she simply continued doing her job with quiet dignity. Daniel stopped several feet away, suddenly uncertain how to begin a conversation he had never imagined having. Ava noticed him only after finishing with the guests. She turned politely and offered the same respectful smile she had given everyone else that evening. "Good evening, sir. Is there anything I can help you with?" Her voice remained steady, free of sarcasm or bitterness. Daniel found himself unable to answer immediately. For the first time in many years, the words he needed did not come easily. Finally he spoke. "Actually, I am the one who needs your help." Ava looked at him with quiet curiosity, but said nothing. Daniel took a slow breath before continuing. "I have just learned about your professional background." Ava lowered her eyes briefly before meeting his gaze again. "That was a long time ago." Daniel nodded. "Maybe, but right now my company is facing a serious problem. The negotiation inside that conference room cannot move forward without someone who understands multiple languages and international commercial terminology." Ava remained silent for several seconds. She glanced toward the closed conference room doors where anxious executives were beginning to gather in the hallway. "You already have a legal team," she answered gently. "They are very capable." Daniel gave a small, honest smile. Capable is no longer enough. The words surprised even him because they carried no trace of the confidence that had defined him all evening. The delegates trust someone who understands not only their language, but also their culture. "They remember you." Ava looked genuinely surprised. "They remember me?" Daniel nodded. The certainty that had surrounded him all evening had disappeared, replaced by sincere humility. She answered softly, "An apology has value only when it is followed by different actions." Daniel accepted the words without argument. "Then let me begin with one. I am asking, not ordering. Would you be willing to help us finish this negotiation?" Ava looked toward the conference suite once more before quietly removing the white service towel from her arm and folding it neatly over the serving tray. She took one calm breath, knowing that the next decision would change not only the future of a $4.2 billion agreement, but also the course of two very different lives. A true expert never needs to announce their expertise because confidence speaks most clearly through quiet actions. Ava Carter looked down at the neatly folded service towel resting on the silver tray before handing it to another waitress with a gentle smile. "Would you please cover my tables for a little while?" she asked. Her coworker nodded without hesitation, sensing from the unusual expression on Ava's face that something important was unfolding. Ava straightened her black waitress apron, brushed away a nearly invisible wrinkle, and calmly followed Daniel Whitmore toward the executive conference suite. Neither of them spoke during the short walk through the marble hallway. The silence itself revealed how dramatically the balance between them had changed. Only minutes earlier, Daniel had viewed Ava as someone beneath his attention. Now he found himself matching his pace to hers, opening the heavy conference room door before she reached it. As they entered, every conversation stopped. More than 20 executives and international delegates turned toward the unexpected visitor wearing a hotel uniform instead of an expensive business suit. A few members of Daniel's own leadership team exchanged uncertain glances, clearly questioning whether inviting a waitress into one of the largest negotiations in company history was an act of desperation. Ava noticed every doubtful expression but allowed none of them to affect her composure. She quietly greeted the room with a warm smile before thanking everyone for their patience. The lead representative from Japan immediately stood and bowed respectfully. "Miss Carter," he said, "it is an honor to see you again." Several delegates from Europe recognized her as well, offering polite greetings that surprised nearly every executive from Sterling Global. Daniel watched the reactions carefully. The respect these accomplished negotiators showed Ava could not be manufactured or rehearsed. It had clearly been earned years earlier through professionalism rather than status. Ava accepted the greetings with genuine humility before asking for permission to review the current agenda and supporting documents. Within only a few minutes, she noticed several technical phrases translated differently across various language editions of the contract. She carefully placed the documents side by side and began explaining each inconsistency with remarkable clarity, moving naturally between English, French, German, Japanese, and Mandarin whenever delegates requested clarification. She never raised her voice, never attempted to impress anyone, and never interrupted another speaker. Instead, she listened carefully before responding with thoughtful precision that immediately reduced confusion throughout the room. The atmosphere slowly transformed. What had felt tense only moments earlier became focused and cooperative. Delegates who had previously spoken through cautious legal language began communicating more openly because they trusted that every idea would be represented accurately. Daniel remained silent, observing a leadership style entirely different from his own. Ava never tried to control the conversation. She simply created an environment where everyone else could understand one another. Halfway through the discussion, a senior legal advisor pointed toward a financial appendix involving long-term infrastructure obligations. The wording appeared identical in English and French, yet Ava gently asked everyone to pause. After carefully comparing both versions, she looked up with quiet concern. "These two paragraphs may seem similar," she explained, "but they assign responsibility in very different ways. If this language remains unchanged, each side could honestly believe they have agreed to different obligations." The room became perfectly still as attorneys from every delegation immediately began reviewing the section she had identified. Realizing that the future of the entire $4.2 billion agreement now rested on the careful attention of the woman almost everyone had overlooked when she first walked through the ballroom, carrying nothing more than a serving tray. The difference between failure and success is sometimes hidden inside a single sentence that everyone else overlooked. Every attorney around the conference table leaned closer to the documents as Ava Carter quietly pointed to the paragraph that had captured her attention. She did not rush to explain or attempt to prove herself right. Instead, She patiently placed the English, French, German, and Japanese versions side by side before inviting each delegation to examine the wording together. The English version assigns operational responsibility, she said calmly. The French version suggests operational control, while the German text implies supervisory authority. Those three legal meanings are not identical. If these documents are signed in their current form, each party could honestly believe it has accepted a different obligation. The room fell completely silent. Senior attorneys immediately began comparing every line with remarkable urgency. Within moments, quiet conversations spread across the table as legal specialists confirmed what Ava had discovered. The inconsistency had survived months of drafting because each translation had been reviewed independently rather than collectively. None of the differences appeared significant until every version was examined together. The lead representative from Germany slowly removed his glasses and smiled with genuine admiration. "Miss Carter," he said, "you have prevented what could have become years of unnecessary litigation." The representative from Japan nodded respectfully. "Our board would never have approved this agreement with conflicting terminology. We would have postponed the signing indefinitely." Daniel Whitmore listened without interrupting. Every compliment directed toward Ava reminded him how quickly he had judged someone based on a few carefully spoken words instead of genuine ability. Across the table, financial advisors relaxed for the first time that evening as attorneys worked together to create one unified version of the agreement. Rather than creating conflict, Ava encouraged cooperation. Whenever two delegates disagreed over a phrase, she carefully explained not only the vocabulary, but also the cultural and legal context behind each expression. Her goal was never to prove one side correct. Her goal was to ensure that every participant left the room sharing exactly the same understanding. As the revised language was completed, the atmosphere changed completely. The cautious tension that had filled the conference suite was replaced by quiet confidence. Delegates who had arrived expecting another exhausting negotiation now exchanged smiles and thoughtful conversation. One by one, every representative confirmed that the revised agreement accurately reflected the intentions of all participating organizations. The chief legal advisor from Sterling Global looked toward Daniel before speaking with unmistakable relief. "Everything is now legally consistent across every language. We are ready to proceed." Daniel slowly nodded, but instead of immediately celebrating the agreement, his eyes turned toward Ava. She had already stepped slightly away from the conference table, allowing the executives and attorneys to finalize the paperwork without drawing attention to herself. She neither expected applause nor sought recognition. To her, solving the problem had simply been the responsible thing to do. Minutes later, as each delegation signed the final documents, a wave of applause filled the conference suite. Cameras waiting outside were informed that the $4.2 billion agreement had officially been completed. News spread rapidly throughout the ballroom as guests celebrated what they believed had been another flawless corporate victory. Only the people inside that room understood how close everything had come to falling apart, and how one woman wearing a black waitress apron had quietly protected years of work without ever asking for credit. Daniel realized that the most valuable person in the building had never occupied the corner office. She had been serving coffee only a short walk away, waiting for someone to see beyond the uniform and recognize the extraordinary wisdom standing in plain sight. Respect becomes meaningful only when it is offered after pride has been surrendered. The signing ceremony concluded beneath a wave of applause that echoed through the executive conference suite before spilling into the grand ballroom outside. News reporters prepared their cameras as guests celebrated what appeared to be another remarkable achievement for Sterling Global. Investors congratulated one another, photographers captured smiling executives, and television hosts spoke enthusiastically about the historic $4.2 billion agreement. Amid the excitement, Ava Carter quietly gathered the translated documents she had reviewed and placed them neatly into organized folders before stepping away from the conference table. She had done exactly what had been asked of her, and in her mind, that was enough. She glanced toward the hallway. intending to return to the responsibilities she had accepted when her shift began earlier that evening. Before she could reach the door, Daniel Whitmore stood from his chair. "Miss Carter," he said clearly. His voice carried across the room, causing every conversation to stop. Ava turned politely. Daniel took several measured steps until he stood beside her rather than above her. For a brief moment, he looked around the conference suite at the executives, attorneys, international delegates, and journalists who had witnessed both the beginning and the ending of the evening. Then he spoke with complete honesty. "Before this meeting began, I made a judgment that I deeply regret. I looked at a uniform instead of a person. I heard an accent instead of listening to wisdom. I assumed that confidence belonged only to those with impressive titles, and I was completely wrong." The room remained perfectly silent. Daniel continued without attempting to protect his reputation. "This agreement exists today because of Ava Carter. She corrected mistakes that every one of us overlooked. She earned the trust of our international partners through knowledge, patience, and respect. More importantly, she demonstrated the kind of leadership that every executive in this room, including me, should strive to practice." Several delegates nodded in agreement. The lead representative from Japan stepped forward and smiled warmly. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "today your company gained more than a successful agreement. It gained an opportunity to remember that wisdom is not determined by position." Gentle applause began from one side of the room before spreading naturally until everyone present was standing. The applause was not loud because people felt obligated to participate. It was sincere because they understood they had witnessed something much larger than a business victory. Ava looked around the room with quiet humility before raising one hand slightly to acknowledge the appreciation. "Thank you," she said softly. "I am grateful for your kindness, but tonight was never about me. Every successful negotiation depends on people who are willing to listen before speaking and understand before judging. That is something all of us can choose to do." Her simple words settled over the room more powerfully than any prepared corporate speech. Daniel smiled with genuine respect, recognizing that even after receiving the praise she deserved, Ava remained focused on the lesson rather than the recognition. As photographers captured the historic moment, the images that would appear across newspapers and business journals the following morning showed something few people ever expected to see. A white billionaire chief executive officer stood beside a black waitress, not as employer and employee, not as powerful and powerless, but as two professionals united by a lesson that money could never purchase and success alone could never teach. Real change does not begin when people applaud the right person. It begins when they refuse to make the same mistake again. The celebration inside the Sterling Grand Convention Center gradually settled into quiet conversations as reporters interviewed executives and photographers captured the final moments of the historic evening. Yet the story spreading through the ballroom was no longer centered on the $4.2 billion agreement. Guests spoke instead about the unexpected woman in a black waitress apron whose calm intelligence had transformed a failing negotiation into a remarkable success. Some admitted they had walked past her for hours without giving her a second glance. Others quietly reflected on how easily appearances had shaped their own assumptions. Ava Carter accepted every compliment with the same gentle smile before thanking the hotel manager for allowing her to assist during the emergency. Without asking for special treatment, she returned to the staff area, removed her black waitress apron, neatly folded it inside her locker, and prepared to end her shift just as she had planned when the evening began. She expected the extraordinary night to become nothing more than a memorable chapter in her own life. Daniel Whitmore, however, understood that the lesson could not end with an apology. Early the next morning, before financial news networks even finished celebrating Sterling Global's successful agreement, Daniel called an emergency executive meeting at the company's headquarters. Every senior leader expected another discussion about international expansion. Instead, Daniel began by displaying a single photograph on the large conference screen. It showed Ava standing quietly beside the conference table while experienced executives listened carefully to her explanation. No one spoke as the image filled the room. Yesterday, we nearly lost the most important agreement in our company's history because we confused appearance with ability. That failure belongs to me first, but it also belongs to every system that encouraged us to overlook talent simply because it arrived wearing the wrong uniform. Several executives lowered their eyes, remembering their own doubts when Ava first entered the conference suite. Daniel continued with calm determination. Beginning today, Sterling Global will change how we identify leadership, evaluate potential, and treat every individual who walks through our doors. Respect will no longer depend on job titles, clothing, or first impressions. It will depend on character, knowledge, and contribution. Over the following weeks, those words became more than promises. Hiring practices were carefully reviewed to reduce unnecessary bias. Cross-department learning programs allowed employees at every level to share expertise with senior leadership. Hospitality staff, maintenance teams, administrative assistants, and junior analysts were invited to innovation forums where their ideas received the same thoughtful consideration as proposals from executives. Managers completed new leadership training focused on listening before judging and asking questions before making assumptions. The changes were noticed almost immediately. Employees who had once remained silent began contributing valuable ideas. Departments communicated more openly. Collaboration replaced unnecessary hierarchy, and morale steadily improved throughout the organization. Reporters who initially covered the $4.2 billion agreement soon returned with a different story. They described a company that had discovered an unexpected competitive advantage by recognizing human potential wherever it appeared. Daniel read one article late one evening before quietly setting it aside. He realized that the greatest achievement of the past month was not the agreement that strengthened Sterling Global's future. It was the culture that had begun to change because one remarkable woman had shown an entire company that true excellence rarely announces itself before it quietly proves everyone wrong. Months later, the most powerful transformations could no longer be measured on financial statements because they were written instead in the way people chose to treat one another. Winter had given way to the warmth of early spring, and the headquarters of Sterling Global reflected a quieter kind of confidence than it had before the historic negotiation. Employees from every department greeted one another by name. Junior analysts spoke comfortably during executive meetings, and ideas were judged by their merit rather than the title printed on a business card. Visitors often commented that the atmosphere felt different, although few could immediately explain why. Daniel Whitmore understood the reason every time he walked through the lobby. The framed photograph displayed near the entrance no longer celebrated the signing of the $4.2 billion agreement. Instead, it captured a simple moment from that unforgettable evening, showing a black waitress standing beside a conference table while seasoned executives listened with complete attention. Below the photograph appeared a single sentence chosen by Daniel himself. Respect begins where assumptions end. Ava Carter never asked for recognition, yet her influence quietly continued to grow throughout the organization. At Daniel's invitation, she accepted a position as Global Communication and Cultural Strategy Advisor, balancing international consulting with leadership education inside Sterling Global. Rather than teaching employees how to speak more languages, she taught them how to listen more carefully, ask better questions, and recognize potential that might otherwise remain unseen. Her workshops quickly became the most requested leadership sessions in the company because they focused on practical humility instead of impressive slogans. Managers often left those meetings realizing that the greatest barrier to innovation had never been a lack of talent. It had been the habit of deciding too quickly who deserved to be heard. Daniel attended every session without requesting special treatment. He usually sat near the back of the room with a notebook in his hands, listening as carefully as everyone else. One afternoon, after a leadership seminar had ended, a young intern approached Ava with quiet hesitation. "May I ask you something?" he said. "How did you stay so calm after being embarrassed in front of everyone that night?" Ava smiled thoughtfully before answering. "Because another person's opinion does not change who you are. Character is built long before someone else notices it. If you know your value, You do not have to argue for it every time someone misunderstands you. Daniel happened to overhear her response as he walked past the open doorway. He paused for a moment, silently reflecting on how different his own life might have been if he had learned that lesson much earlier. Later that evening, as the lights of Manhattan once again illuminated the skyline outside his office, he looked across the city that had rewarded ambition for generations. He still believed in success, discipline, and high standards, but he now understood that the strongest leaders were not those who spoke first or stood tallest. They were the ones willing to admit when they had been wrong and wise enough to recognize greatness even when it arrived wearing an ordinary uniform. The $4.2 billion agreement remained one of the largest achievements in Sterling Global's history, yet people rarely remembered it for the numbers. They remembered it because, on one unforgettable evening, a man who believed he could command every room discovered that true leadership begins the moment pride gives way to grace, and a woman who never demanded respect quietly taught an entire company that the greatest power in the world is not wealth, status, or influence, but the courage to see the extraordinary value hidden inside another human being.